Okay, sorry, it's just talking to me. Hang on. Okay, so I want to think about how the place of abstract painting in Richter's oeuvre and how that communicates with the world around it. And the work has always been recognized for its evasion, for its refusal to take political positions or to make statements on the historical events that he represents. And here we have these two images from his series of the Baader Meinhof. The series is called October 17th, 1988, which he painted. Those of you who read the article will know he painted these from, they were originally press photographs that were taken in the cells of the Baader Meinhof group when they died. And then he took them out of they were taken out of the police archives and published in magazines. He then took them out of magazines, rephotographed them, put them into his archive called Atlas. And then his process is one when he does what are called these photo paintings. He projects the image onto a canvas and then paints the photographic image. So you can see it's quite a process. And one of the things which is always said about Richter's work is how far removed from reality and truth it actually is. And he's much more interested in showing that nothing can be pinned down, that nothing can be fully identified. Hang on, why is that not working? Okay, and here we have on the left September his very small painting of September 11th from 2009, and one of his series of the Birkenau series, which I can talk more about later if you would like. That it was originally photographs taken. I can talk about that later, but they come from Auschwitz. They're the only these paintings, the series of paintings that you can see on Dore's wall behind her, are taken from. They began as photographs that were taken in Auschwitz, the only surviving photographs that we have from inside the concentration camps. So you can see how reality for him is always something that is obscured, that is in motion, that is a long way from the painting as we see it. And what I want to talk about specifically is how the paintings invite us to question our relationship to painting and to representation, to the value of objects in the world, to the value of painting as an object. And what he does, I will argue, is that he pushes painting beyond its own limits, challenging our vision, forcing us to reflect on what we see, and to interrogate the conditions of looking at painting. Okay, and through this, he's having a significant impact on the so-called real world. Okay. So as I said in The Truth Is Always Get Grey, in which the final chapter is devoted to Richter's grey paintings, all of the ongoing struggles of his work creates uncertainty and ambivalence and contradiction find their most articulate expression in the color grey. For Richter, grey as a color enjoys the same indeterminacy, the same inability to be pinned down as painting and reality. Grey absorbs light, it reflects light, it is the accumulation of all colors. It is its own color. It spans the spectrum from dark to light, cool to warm, opaque to luminous, representation to abstraction, and so on and so on. So it's constantly moving. So here we see some abstract works and some representational work. And here we see on the left, one of his abstract works from the 1970s, and then Clouds, Representation. I would argue that the ambivalence that we see in the grey is in itself a kind of politics. It's a politics that's enabled by grey, defined by a facilitation of different ways of looking at painting, and by extension of the world beyond it. Okay, so these two images from the 18th of October 1977 that were painted in 1988. In the figurative paintings, the challenge to vision can be corroborated by demonstrating that Richter doesn't actually paint the events themselves. He paints their representation, and hence the painting becomes an archive. Often as the images appear in the press or in other images that are circulating. He collects images, he places them into the archive, his archive, Atlas, which I can talk more about if you want, if you're interested. Then he removes them, he projects the image onto a canvas and paints over the photographic projection. So we never ever see the event itself, even though we're under the illusion that we're looking at a version of its documentation. We are openly deceived by the image. We are at least 4, sometimes 5 times removed from the image itself. So he's painting the image of an image of an image of an image. But how do Richter's abstract paintings reach beyond their frame? How do they move out into the world? And I want to suggest that it is in fact through the very same mechanism of reproduction, deception, misperception, even though this process plays out differently in the abstract works than it does in those which include a figure. So let's have a look at 8 grey, Achtgrey. Okay. So there are 8, obviously there are 8 of these mirrored panels. So it's a single work, 8 grey, first made in 2001 for the 21st Century Museum of Contemporary Art in Kanazawa in Japan, and duplicated in 2002 for the Deutsche Guggenheim in Berlin, with much larger dimensions. In them, in 8 grey, paint, support, frame, and vitrine become indistinguishable. So each panel is painting reduced to a single grey reflective surface. So he's fusing at very, very high temperatures. He fuses paint and glass, or pigment and glass. So by representing and re-articulating the changing vision, changing nature of vision and perception, these paintings engage the world beyond them, literally, when they re-articulate the spaces they occupy. So in them we see the spaces they occupy. They're simultaneously abstract, because they're just grey mirrored surfaces, and figurative. So they're occupying this interstice of meaning and nihilistic vision, alignment between painting and architecture, painting and performance, painting and sculpture, painting and photography, painting and cinema. And I can talk more about that afterwards as well if you're interested. The panels of 8 grey are not necessarily his greatest works, but they can be held up as a mirror to the processes of reproduction, deception, misperception, understanding, and deliberate generation of misunderstanding of painting. And of course, that they're painted in grey further underlines their claims for painting and its role in the world. So in addition to everything else, they're ambiguous and ephemeral and iconic, and they're sort of impossible. Although the 8 grey mirrored panels are an accumulation and culmination of his concerns over 50 years, in a typical Richter gesture, the opposite is also true. There's nothing in these panels that allows us to trace their history. So the reflective mirror surface has no memory. Okay. Nothing links them to the paintings that have come before them. And yet, of course, I'm arguing that they're a culmination of all the Gray paintings that he has done before them. So it's like they're the archive of painting as archive, but also the destruction or the effacement, if you like, of the archive. Okay. So because at the very least, in the complete fusion of glass support and paint through this industrial process he uses, the paint in 8 Gray is no longer visible on the surface of the work. So you can't see any brush stroke or anything. We may even go so far as to suggest that they're no longer paintings. The defining features of painting have been removed. They are now flat, grey, reflective surfaces. So there's no brush stroke, for example. Okay, they're also far removed from anything resembling an image because they're playing with visibility, tactility, texture, movement, in this sort of tension between transparency and opacity. They claim that painting is produced and reproducible. So they're devaluing any notion of originality, of gesture, the presence of an artist. The archive from which an original image is drawn is long gone, long forgotten. So the Gray abstract on the right, in the right, is of course completely removed from 8 Gray. Also, each panel is on hinges, so it's theoretically able to be tilted to different angles by the visitor to the museum. So it's interactive, which painting is not. In reality, Richter very consciously places the panels and gallery lighting so that we're not allowed to touch them. Okay, so they're controlled. We don't get to move them at all. So just to say, each of the Gray, so there are 3 or 4, just to say there are 3 or 4 versions of 8 Gray, and each one is a replication of others, but they are slightly different in dimensions, and that each one is made for the site in which they sit. So there's one here in Berlin, there's one in Japan, there's one at Deer in upstate New York. So it's not just paint, but the identity of painting is also thrown out of these works. On one level, we could say that 8 Gray has nothing to do with painting at all. They're an installation, a piece of architecture. They're sculpture, or even we could say a film screen. Okay. And the film screen reference, of course, is, we see all of these images on their surfaces. So the substance of paint and painting and painted surfaces is really pushed out of these works, okay, beyond the limits of the medium. It's the end of the medium, if you like, as the medium transforms into other media, film and theatre and architecture. So this process of transformation is the defining feature of Richter's painting, from object to image, from archival photograph to screen to mirror to a mere reflection. It's a practice marked by disappearance, disintegration, and forgetting. And yet, of course, again in true Richter style, the mirror-like surfaces of these works are perhaps his most insistent reinforcement of the importance of painting. So the memory of what was reflected in the image, the artist's oeuvre as a recurring and constantly reproduced phenomenon. And I'm going to explore this idea by looking at some of his precursors. So Benjamin Buchloh cites this work for glass paint, 4 panes of glass from 1967 as a precursor to the 2002 installation at the Deutsche Guggenheim. So these 4 sheets of glass have, like all of Richter's glass works, had all the intimacy, the gesture, dynamism, paint is removed. They are, after Duchamp's The Bride Stripped Bare by her bachelors, even the large glass, they're enigmatic, with reference to nothing other than their own meaninglessness. As transparent pieces of glass, they are no longer paintings. The meaning of 4 panes of glass becomes determined by reflections on their surface, a strategy or technique that recurs over the course of Richter's oeuvre, though of course it will take different colors, different shapes and forms. Like 8 Gray, the 4 panes of glass is transparent, reflective, and in both, we look through the glass as well as at the images on the surface at one and the same time. Okay, so here we can see the images in the left side, we can see the images reflected in the glass planes, as well as, and this is when the glass panes are in installation, we will always see them in relation to other paintings of Richter's, which are reflected on the glass, and we look through them, the glass, at other works, depending on where it's placed. Okay. So in recent years, Richter has taken this confounding use of glass to another level in works such as this, the one straight ahead, so the one at the back, 11 panes of glass. So this is an installation at Panorama, that Tate Modern installation from 2011. In these works of stacked glass, the sheets of glass absorb and reflect the contradictions and conundrums of painted representation, as well as creating new ones. With 11 sheets of glass, as we see in the work at the back of this space, the mirrored image of the viewer is refracted and broken, repeated to infinity. And we see that on the right, and we see that again here on the left in 7. The coherence of the reflections, thus the image on sheets of glass, is shattered. In certain displays, depending on how he's organized it, and remember that all of his exhibitions, he basically controls. I mean, he's very involved in the exhibition always. So in certain displays, the installation further complicates the sheets and their meaning when one or more of Richter's paintings are placed on the opposite or surrounding walls, as we see here. These images are then seen in fragments, again, as you see on the left, behind through the multiple glass sheets. With this seeing through takes on a whole new meaning. Seeing through comes to mean a re-seeing or a reviewing, a seeing again, seeing differently. Richter's works, they appear as unique versions depending on where we stand in relation to the glass structure and how they refract and reflect behind it. The paintings disrupt the image of the viewer on the surface and simultaneously recreate multiple new images in fractured form. So the importance of painting becomes restored, even though the images rupture and unpredictably reflect painting. The additional layer of representation, as well as of the meaning of the earlier works, seen refracted through sheets, is typical of Richter. The destruction of the image is as important as the establishment of another image and of its significance in the first place. And so the image is replaced as well as fractured, revised. And I think this process is akin to taking an image from an archive, his archive of Atlas, and making it disintegrate across time in 5 generations distance from the original. It's just that here, the process of making ambiguous is done through replacement and fragmentation rather than a disintegration that comes through proliferation. I can talk about that more afterwards if you like. The same interruption and simultaneous rearticulation occurs on the grey surface of each panel of 8 grey. Okay, so this is from St. Louis. Because we get this because of the visitor's reflection, as you see here in the images. The shifting images of the gallery space and any other activity that's taking place within the exhibition. We stand in front of the panels, we look at them, we look in them, we watch them. The resultant images of ourselves and the space of the exhibition in reflection are like a proliferation of painted images, the perpetual recreation of the meaning, of these non-paintings. So it's constantly shifting, and there's no one single static meaning, because there's no one single static image, because the image is created by the viewer who's moving around. This infinite flexibility of grey becomes a screen onto which the dramatic narrative of our experience of the exhibition and our vision unfolds. So when he was asked in 2004 by Jan Ton Prikker what he sees in his mirrored paintings, Richter responds, and I quote, "Myself. But then I immediately see that it functions like a painting, just more perfectly. And just like a painting, it shows something that isn't there, at least not there where we see it. So the mirror would be," and then the interviewer says, "So the mirror would be the perfect artist," and Richter responds, "Exactly." Okay. So these are the deer installations. The grey is the screen that makes this mirror possible. Grey is the color of the images that we mistake for reality. So he does, of course, make these same panels in red, but that adds a whole new dimension of meaning, because red carries with it so many different meanings. Returning to the narrative of contradiction in which Richter's paintings emphasize antithesis or negation in the very same breath that they instantiate presence of their opposite. If four panes of glass mark the evacuation, thus the antithesis of painting, painting simultaneously becomes the subject or concern of these reflective surfaces. The same happens in 8 grey. Painting is both negated and is also the substance of the grey mirrored surfaces. So despite the fact that the paint itself has been transformed through this fusion with glass, and as Benjamin Buchloh argues, the panes are in every way related to the earlier working glass. So 8 grey is both painting become grey glass and glass fused with paint, removing the identity as painting. And the removal reminds us of what they're not, i.e. painting beyond their limits. So there's another genre of Richter's work that prefaces the grey reflective panels of 8 grey, one that Buchloh mentions only in passing. The more than 130 grey paintings produced from 1960s onwards. The 8 grey panels of simultaneously mirrored and opaque glass might be the culmination of his lifetime fascination with grey paint, painting in grey. Fused together with the grey plates, the paintings mark the destination of explorations in grey. And at the same time, they offer a way of seeing the world, a way of relating to the world through seeing it from different perspectives. So if Atlas is a collection of images, is a way of seeing the world through the eyes of Gerhard Richter, his collection of photographs in Atlas. In a different but related way, the grey glass panels of 8 grey are themselves an archive of sorts. Thus, they are also completely different from the grey paintings. To put it another way, beyond their substance, this grey paint fused with glass, the panels look to the past of Richter's use of grey and inwards at their own density of meaning and association, in turn outwards to the world in which they're exhibited and thus given new meaning. So they're another repetition, always embracing difference, of Richter's concerns in paint, of how Richter sees the world, in the same way that if we want to look at Atlas, his collection of archival photographs, as a way of seeing Richter's vision of the world, the painting becomes the same. If we look long enough, we find in the panels a relationship between art and politics, art and history, art and artists, art and all other media, particularly when they're exhibited at the Deutsche Bank on Unter den Linden in 2002. The image of the spectator reflected back to herself, the building of the Deutsche Bank on which the Guggenheim offers the ground floor, the world outside Unter den Linden become visible on the glass surface. And just to explain, so this was a gallery that was in the bank, in the actual headquarters of the German bank itself, on this very famous street in the middle of Berlin, and of course what was East Berlin. And usually the space, all of the windows were closed, but Richter insisted for this exhibition that all of the windows be opened so that they could be reflected on the painting. So this real sort of, a sense of the economic history of Berlin, and plus this very sort of checkered history of this street in the center of East Berlin. Okay. And of course, the other thing we might have to remember is that they're reiterations. So these are in Berlin, but they're reiterations of panels that were first installed in Japan, and of course subsequently installed in America at Dia. So it's this idea of each repetition brings with it a sort of a memory of the previous iteration. So painting becomes like an event, if you like, and simultaneously a celebration of grey or color-filled painting. So these are very complex, multi-layered historical worlds that are going on in these works. And as I'm sort of trying to get at, they approach the notion of the labyrinthine on these surfaces, and then they, of course, images become screens, and screens become sculptures, and sculptures become architectural installations and windows, in a world in which history and art of all kinds coexist in the pursuit of a redefinition of both. So coming back to the significance of grey. Grey is the exemplary colour for Richter's pursuit of ephemerality, his insistence on contradiction, and the embrace of impossibility. His grey is the palette for an interstitial world, creating both intellectual and emotional spaces that invite the viewer to insert and reinsert themselves and their memory into the narrative, not only of Richter's paintings, but of course of German history, as is seen through the windows of Deutsche Guggenheim, or in the Birkenau paintings that are behind Dore on her screen. This is, it's always about the narrative of German history. So of course that then it takes on this political and social significance. Okay, so sorry, actually I'm going to go back. So Richter's grey is never a single color, never a single tone or temperature. Even the way he applies grey continues to change throughout his career. It's a mixture of grey, is the mixture of all colors, all greys together on one canvas, a rainbow grey that sometimes begins on the doctor knife and at other times does not appear until paint is applied to the canvas. So it's when he's stripping away and grey comes out of the paint that is already on the canvas as well. It's never monochromatic, always a multiplicity of indefinable colours, shifting in intensity, thickness, luminosity, viscosity. The most common critical approach to Richter's use of grey follows a somewhat superficial interpretation of the artist's own claim, of his own claim that grey, he says grey is, in interview, he says it's nothing, it's nil, it's non-commitment, it's this kind of dead nothing. He writes, and I quote, "The grey paintings, a painted grey surface, completely monochromatic. They come from a motivation or result from a state that was very negative." And as you can see, they're not monochromatic. They never were. Even exhibitions, but that's how they're always talked about. Even exhibitions such as the one at Bergdorf in Switzerland in 2004, which was devoted completely to grey work, is without color, cold without color. So it's this reiteration, it's all monochrome, when clearly the painting is not monochrome. Okay, so the paintings don't support the description of Richter's or of the way that they're talked about in exhibition. Okay. So I'm just going to go on to cage. Okay, so abstract and a cage painting. So from the 1960s and 1970s through the photo paintings of the 1980s, so like the Baader-Meinhof works, to the abstract works of the late 1990s and 2000s, Richter's grey develops dramatically. In the early works, grey is the colour of steel and industry, as you see on the left. It is the colour of industrialization that both challenges and inspires the future of painting at the turn of the 20th century. And then in paintings such as the corrugated eye, the curtain here, from the 1960s, it struggles with, grey struggles with industrial processes that enabled it. The rich texture, fluidity, and simultaneous ethereality of grey paint as he applies it to the canvas of grey paintings is often reminiscent of steel. Even more so with the window series, in which the work becomes geometrical, for want of a better word. There's always a tension between different greys, between rationalization and its opposite. So we are reminded that the windows and sheets with their shadows and blurs are painted representations. However precise they may appear at first glance, they too are infused, like their grey paint, with ambiguity, inexplicability, and confusion. They might be seen as modernist grids, but they're anything but gridded. The optical illusion of the curtains, what have I got? The optical illusion of the curtains, windows, corrugated iron, doors, creates images that oscillate between abstract vertical lines of light and dark grey, and the impression at times indecipherability of objects claimed to be represented by the paintings, but are not. Is the shadow in the, for example, in the window painting on the right, is the shadow before or behind the object that casts it? Is the curtain revealing or concealing what is behind or perhaps in front of it? The grey oil-based and acrylic paint is the grey of corrugated iron. So like other artists working in the 60s and 70s, Richter paints these objects to examine painting as an object. The grey paint can be thick, textured, rough, and material, or it can appear thin, smooth, even opaque, especially when it's sprayed, as it is in the left. in grey, not only are we confused by the deceptive logic of paint and what is painted, i.e. the objects, but the objects are transformed into paint. Already in the 1960s and 1970s, in Richter's grey paintings, we are given ephemerality and ambiguity as we look into and at the image. So to finish up, from 2000 onwards, in 8 grey and later in the many grey mirrors that he made, he does away with figuration and representational reference. The doors, sea, sky, windows, corrugated iron from the 1960s and 70s were the illusion of represented objects. And here, they are the material of both representation and the represented. So nevertheless, and this is to finish up, including the early works that push at the limits of figuration towards illusion and abstraction, we can already see the indications of Richter's simultaneous experimenting with the use of paint to facilitate a deceptive, sometimes confusing visual experience, leading us to question our place, our own body, and shifting identity in relationship to the painting. His commitment to abstraction thus goes hand in hand, and always has, with a challenge to the conditions, process, and hermeneutics of vision. And Richter's abstraction in grey has always placed the illusions of painting, the deception of the viewer at the centre, which is, after all, the real politics. The real object of painting is the viewer, particularly as it resonates well beyond the surface of the canvas and the four sides of the frame. Thanks.
Thank you, Frances. There's a lot there to talk about.
Yeah, I just wonder whether anyone wants any clarification or wants me to talk about anything that I touched on more.